Hi, I'm Vaune and welcome to my sewing room. Today I want to show you how I cut bias strips. I get asked about this a lot when I'm teaching classes, so I thought I'd show you right here in my sewing room. So before we start cutting bias, what is bias? Now, when fabric is woven, there's warp threads that go north and south. This is also the straight of grain. And you've got your selvages that run along the side. The weft threads run left and right, or west and east. This is the cross grain. Most of the bias fabric that I use is for petite piping. Bias works really well for petite piping because when you curve bias fabric, it shapes very nicely without wrinkling or tucking or rippling. So if you're making a little Peter Pan collar and you've got to shape your piping around the collar, it's going to lay flat. It's not going to have ripples in it. And that is something that you really have to watch out for if you're using fabric that's cut on the straight of grain. So bias is a big thing if you're going to be making petite piping. Even if you're using petite piping around what we would consider a flat edge, like at the bottom of a sleeve, it's still going around a body part. So it's going to be better to use bias. So on my fabric, straight of grain goes north and south, cross grain goes east and west, bias grain goes at a 45-degree angle. So as you're getting ready to cut your bias strips, most rotary cutter mats have lines that are corner to corner or 45 degrees. And you can see here this line goes from corner to corner. That's a 45-degree angle. So to start off with, I make one cut that's at a 45-degree angle, and then once I have that cut made, that's what I use as my guideline for the rest of my cuts. Now I've got that cut made, and you can see I've got a nice angle on this corner of my fabric. But it's hard for me to cut from southeast to northwest. It's a lot easier for me to cut south to north. So what I do is I rotate my fabric so that even though this is my bias edge, it is running in a north to south direction. And then I take my fabric and I fold it so that my raw edges are even. That way I can cut south to north and still be on my bias. So I'm going to measure, and then I'm going to cut, and I'm going to measure, and I'm going to cut. And I'll make as many bias strips as I need, measuring and cutting. Now, if I get to the point on my fabric, and this will happen depending on how big your fabric is, as you cut over, it may be that you're getting a little short here, maybe even this much. So once I get down to this point, I'll go ahead and move my fabric, keeping it in the north-south direction, making sure my raw edges are even, and then I can go ahead and I can start measuring and cutting all over again. Now, I know there's a way that you can offset your fabric, seam it, and do a continuous cut so that you have continuous bias binding. I typically don't do that because I'm not binding a quilt. Most of the time when I'm cutting bias binding, it's for petite piping, and very rarely am I going to use a piece that's really long. It's quicker for me to just piece it on my sewing machine if I need something longer, if I'm going around a whole waistline or the hem of a garment. So I'm just measuring and cutting till I have all my bias strips cut, and then when I've got that done, I stop. So that's just a quick, easy way that I use to cut bias strips. If you have any questions, let me know. My email is vaune@vaune.com. Don't forget to subscribe and follow me on my YouTube channel, and I hope to see you back soon in my sewing room.